We're looking at R.E. Hobart's view on compatibilism in relation to free will and determinism. This is based on an article that was published in the journal Mind, a highly respected journal, in 1934, when it was all the more difficult to get published because there weren't that many journals. So in any case, let's make sure that we're clear on the thesis of compatibilism. The two positions, free will and determinism, are entirely consistent. And that is what Hobart endorses. So he claims that he doesn't change the meaning of free will at all. So when we use the term free will, he says we're using it in the full and the natural meaning of the term or the phrase. And he says that determinism has to be true insofar as we have free will. So 1934, quantum mechanics, not really off and broadly accepted yet, but the idea is even if there were indeterminism at the subatomic level, there wouldn't be any indeterminism when it comes to human actions. So determinism is true, and we have free will. That we have free will, we don't have to worry about whether or not we do, because that's a fact of experience. We know that we have free will because we experience our own free actions. So that is what he asserts, that it's pretty clear determinism is true, and it's pretty clear that we have free will. And in fact, he goes on to say that freedom requires determinism. So he says where there's no determinism, where there's an absence of this determinism, then we can't have freedom. There's an absence of freedom. The two go together, and freedom actually requires that determinism in order to work. Now, libertarianism would be the opposing view for Hobart, the idea that we have options to choose to do one thing or another, and that the world is indeterministic. So the libertarian speaks against determinism, but Hobart says the libertarian is confused about what freedom is. And that was a common thesis for compatibilists at that time. And in fact, the reason we're looking at Hobart, even though it's almost a century old, is his ideas and his arguments are very influential on into the 21st century regarding this topic. Now, Hobart assumes that if I'm the source of my action, that means my action is determined by my character. So if we just get really clear on what free will is, then we can see how clearly it is related to determinism. So an underlying assumption that we'll talk about toward the end of the video is that causation implies determination. If there is causation, you have determination. So the idea here is if you call someone good, you say that somebody has a good character, then the actions of that person are caused by their character. And you have to have that connection. And the same is true for bad character. If someone has a bad character, their actions are caused by their character in a deterministic fashion. So that's a challenge for libertarianism. Now we can look at an argument against libertarianism that Hobart presents. And he has this phrase, determinism is free will expressed in the passive voice. I like the phrase. I'm not quite sure what it means, so I didn't put it on the screen. In any case, he proposes a dilemma that faces the proponent of libertarianism, and he's just calls the view of libertarianism the indeterministic freedom. And here's the dilemma. So either one's actions are determined or they are not. It's clear what Hobart thinks, but we're concerned about libertarian view. Now, if they are determined, then there's no indeterministic freedom, and libertarianism is false. If they are determined, we have compatibilism. If they're not determined, and here's the crucial point that compatibilists continued and continue to claim, then the action is rootless or sortless or sourceless or outside of one's control. If you don't determine your actions, then your actions are capricious. So that's not free will, and so libertarianism is false. So either way, libertarianism is not going to make sense, and we know libertarianism is false from this reason. But Hobart doesn't stop there, of course. He goes on to give a positive argument for compatibilism. So he rejects the prominent view against compatibilism, that is libertarianism. Now, he doesn't address hard determinism in this article, but that's kind of out there too. But in any case, he's concerned about the views that say we have freedom. And again, he says it's easy, so to speak, to have freedom. We experience it. Okay, so freedom means the absence of interference with the exercise of power. So if no one's restricting you and you're doing what you want to do, you're free, right? So to be free to do something, to be free to do X, implies that one can do X. To be free to mow my lawn, that implies that I can mow my lawn. And if one can do X, then one has the power to do X. If I'm able to mow my lawn, then obviously I have the power to mow my lawn. And if one has the power to do X, then there's a law relating a person and doing X. If I have the power to mow my lawn, then there are laws, would be, I'm sure, several laws related to me and being able to mow my lawn, actually mowing my lawn. So to be free to do X implies deterministic laws. There has to be that connection in order for you to carry out the desires that you have. And no one, as long as no one's restricting you, then you are free. And that means freedom is compatible with determinism. So that's the positive argument for compatibilism. And again, this form of reasoning for compatibilism continues to this day. Now, a challenge that a libertarian might raise is concerns about the ability to do otherwise. So as you look back on something that you did, you ask, could I have done otherwise? Do I have the ability to do otherwise going forward? Did I have the ability to do otherwise looking into the past? Now, it seems like determinism would rule that out. And that is a very strong concern for libertarianism. However, Hobart claims, of course, we have the ability to do otherwise. The ATDO, as I'm abbreviating it here, one doesn't have to add the phrase if one had wanted to. So normally compatibilists might do that. For example, W.T. Stace does that. You know, you could do otherwise if you had wanted to. So you could have mowed the lawn if you had wanted to. You could have refrained from mowing the lawn if you had wanted to not mow the lawn, right? And so as long as no one's restricting you, you have freedom, and that's just assumed, and we don't have to state this conditional if you had wanted to, because it's assumed, right? It's part of the meaning of being able to do something that we include this hypothetical, this unstated hypothetical, if one had wanted to, because you can't act at all without having a desire to act. You can't mow the lawn without wanting to mow the lawn. Now, I'm one that, generally speaking, doesn't want to mow the lawn, but we have to clarify, of course, when I mow the lawn, that is what I want to do. I want to get the lawn mowed. I want to do it, right? So what Hobart is saying is, yes, we are assuming that conditional, if one had wanted to do otherwise, one could have done otherwise. And we don't have to make it explicit because, in fact, all laws are hypothetical. For example, when you're considering gravity and you have a pen in your hand and you drop the pen, well, we can put that as a conditional. If you drop the pen, it will fall to the floor or on the table or wherever you happen to be. So it's a conditional law, and all laws work like that. Deterministic laws are conditional. So the fact that we're putting in this conditional, if you had wanted to, doesn't mean that there's any particular problem here. And in fact, it's kind of a ridiculous question to ask if one can will in opposition to what is one's strongest desires. It's kind of like Hobart uses the example of, can you turn out the light without trying to turn out the light? No, it's just, well, you will turn out the light if you want to turn out the light when you consider that, assuming again, no restrictions are there. So we have that desire that's built in to do something, and that's always causing us to do what we do. So Hobart affirms what I call the Socratic doctrine that acrasia is impossible. That is, the idea that we don't have weakness of the will, that we always do what we think is best at that time. So people might think, well, no, a lot of people don't do what is best for them, and they know it's not what is best for them. But at the moment, that's what they believe. So consider a person smoking who wants to quit smoking, and they say, smoking's bad for me. I really wish I could quit. And then they go light up. Well, Socrates and Hobart say, well, at that time, they're saying, well, this cigarette, it's better for me to do this than to have the anxiety or tension that goes along with not smoking. So I'm doing what is best for me at this moment so that I can get back to work and focus on working, maybe, right? So causation in one's action doesn't imply compulsion, though, because this is true all the time. We always do what we think is best. So I'm making a video. That's what I think is best for me to be doing right now. There's no compulsion to it. Now, there are causal sequences in action every time that we act. So those who think there's something more than this are like the person who has the element of the locomotive explained to him and seems to understand the process, but then still asks where the horse is. Remember the context, 1934. So the idea is some people just don't get it. Here it is, we lay it out, there's causation and action, and that is free action. And Hobart's frustrated by those who say they don't get it. And we don't need to be concerned about incompatibilism. Whoops, little typo there, sorry about that. For internal causation determines one's free action. So your wish or what you want to do causally determines your will, putting it into action, which of course causally determines the action, right? So there are these three things that lead to action. Now, a point of concern might be raised. What about prediction and then responsibility? So that's a concern. If you can predict exactly what a person's going to do, if they're determined to do it, how could they still be responsible for what they do? Well, Hobart addresses this by saying, look, the ability to predict what somebody is going to do is often of value, and it takes nothing away from freedom or responsibility. In fact, if it's a positive thing, it's a rather a compliment of one's character. So, for example, if you say of someone that you know somebody's going to try to bribe them, or somebody else is concerned that they could be bribed, and you just say, oh, he won't take the money if given the opportunity. I know this person. I know their character. They're not going to succumb to that temptation. So they are determined not to take the money, but that doesn't take anything away from their freedom, or it doesn't matter that we're able to predict that. They're still responsible. They have a positive character. Or again, of course, you could make this a negative one. Yeah, that guy's he would take a bribe. And again, it doesn't take anything away from their responsibility for taking the bribe. And what about fatalism and determinism? Fatalism is something else, and Hobart rejects fatalism. Fatalism is something like the Oedipus story, where the prophet comes and says, you will kill your father and marry your mother, no matter what you do. So Oedipus tries as best he can to make sure that that would never happen, and it ends up happening anyway. Now, that's not determinism. For according to determinism, what you do is relevant to what happens. Whereas with fatalism, it doesn't matter what you do, you're still going to end up, certain things are still going to happen. With determinism, what you do is relevant for what happens. Now, fatalism says, what I do tomorrow is determined to occur. You're going to kill your father, say, no matter how I struggle. Doesn't matter if I move away, hide all my guns and my knives, my sword, what have you, it's still going to happen. That's fatalism. Now, determinism is the idea that what I do tomorrow is determined through my struggle. However it turns out, it's because of what I'm wishing to do, which determines my will, which determines my action. Now, let's think a little bit more about this connection between determinism and responsibility. Hobart says that our actions have to be determined by our character, or we could not be responsible for what we did, right? We couldn't even be responsible for what we did. In fact, indeterminacy would undermine our responsibility. If there's no causal connection between one's character and environment and one's actions, then one's actions are capricious. They're a product of chance. It's just like a coin flip or a roll of the dice. You got to have that causal connection. So if actions are by chance, this randomness, then we should not hold a person responsible, ever, right? Okay, what about punishment? So how does this fit with punishment? Hobart says, when we think about punishment, it's legitimate, even if everything is determined, because it serves two purposes. So, of course, this has to do with philosophy of jurisprudence and punishment and the purpose for that. But Hobart says deterrence is a legitimate means or reason for punishment. So punishment deters the offender from repeating the offense, and deterrence for others. When you punish one person and they see that that person is punished for doing an action, then they don't do it themselves. So these purposes of punishment, in fact, require determinism, says Hobart. You have to have that causal connection between the punishment and deterrence, or punishment would not and could not work. So determinism is central, important for freedom, for moral responsibility, for punishment. But there are a couple problems with this view that I'll go ahead and add fairly quickly. One shows up on the screen, which oddly doesn't have the dark blue on the frame, but in any case, a problem for this view is a dilemma. So recall this view of Hobart that wish causally determines one's action, which causally determines the will. I'm sorry, I had that reversed. Your wish determines the will, and that determines the action, right? So there's this sequence of events. But wait a minute. So one might reflect and say, is the wishing or the initial wanting determined? Now, if yes, then where's the ability to do otherwise, right? If the wishing itself is determined, what good does it say you could have done otherwise if you had wanted to, if the want itself is determined? And it seems like it would be. So we wouldn't have the ability to do otherwise. And that is important for the idea of freedom, which is why he said that he maintains it. But if no, then of course, if it's not determined, then everything he said about libertarianism and a problem with indeterministic world would be effective against his own view. His criticism would fall back on his own view. So that's a problem. A second problem has to do with his view of causation itself. So we could put this in a question. Does causation always imply determination? Now, there are different views about this. Hobart obviously says yes. We could flip this around and ask, can there be causation without determination? Of course, Hobart would say no to that question. But imagine this scenario. Suppose you set a bomb at a stadium, a large bomb at a stadium, and it's going to detonate if a Geiger counter is stimulated. So you set up a Geiger counter and it's connected into the bomb to set it off, but only if it's stimulated, only if it's identifying radioactivity at a certain level. And so you provide a source of radioactivity at the appropriate mass, half-life, and distance so that there's a 50-50 chance that the bomb will go off. Suppose the bomb goes off. Did you cause the explosion? Well, if you accept Hobart's view, you say, well, it wasn't determined to go off, so I'm not responsible. But I don't think that would hold water. It certainly seems like you are morally responsible and legally responsible. Another person has suggested this idea. Suppose there's a general, there's a challenging battle going on. Recall the context again. World War I was the most recent war. So he sends in his crack regiment. The battle's in balance for some time before the general's army succeeds. So does the general get credit for the victory? It seems, yes, we allow that, but it could have gone either way. It seemed like the general was causing the army to succeed by his directions, but it could have gone either way. You could apply the same kind of reasoning for a coach of a basketball team. Say the game's tied, there's 0.7 seconds left. He calls for a certain inbounds play. It works. Doesn't the coach get credit? It could have gone either way, but still it was a good play to call at that time. It was indeterminate whether what the outcome would be, but it seems like the coach calling the play had a causal effect on the winning the game. Again, with this one, it could go either way depending on some of your presumptions there. Now, a third problem is probably the most significant problem, and those are arguments for incompatibilism. PVI, that's Peter Van Inwagen, has a consequence argument that we look at in other videos, and those directly attack compatibilism and argue for the conclusion that compatibilism is false. So those we'll leave for another video.